We do have sign language, so all presenters, please do speak clearly and slowly so that they can follow and keep up. Without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic to our moderator today, Kieren Fitzpatrick, Director of Asia Pacific Forum of the National Human Rights Institution. Kieren, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. I really look forward to participating in today's session. Look, we've got about an hour and 15 minutes and quite a considerable body of content to get through today. So in the interest of opening it up as much as we possibly can to questions from the floor, I'll start. Thanks very much. The purpose of our discussion today is to bring together national human rights institutions in the Pacific region and their partner organisations for a discussion on good practices, the challenges, lessons learned, and the outlook for national human rights institutions in the Pacific region regarding their role and work in the business and human rights area. So national human rights institutions occupy quite a unique position as an interface between civil society and government and the private sector and the international community. They're independent institutions established by the state, but they're mandated to promote and protect human rights through a range of activities, including human rights advocacy, education and awareness raising, monitoring and compliance with international or national constitutional human rights standards, conducting inquiries, investigating human rights violations, and a whole range of other specified and unique functions depending on the context. Now, national human rights institutions are governed by a set of norms that have been adopted by the UN called the Paris Principles. And these Paris Principles have been endorsed by the General Assembly, and they set out the standards for the mandate and function of national human rights institutions. And they require that national human rights institutions have a broad mandate to protect and promote human rights. And that includes, of course, violations committed by the private sector and other non-state actors. So national human rights institutions, in my view, have a critical role to play in the field of business and human rights. A recent report by the UN Working Group on the issue of human rights in transnational corporations and other business enterprises has highlighted this role and describes the diverse ways in which national human rights institutions can facilitate access to remedy for business-related human rights abuses. And that's a key component, of course, of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and I'm sure earlier sessions have addressed that. So we were talking about how national human rights institutions can facilitate access to remedies, and I was suggesting there are a number of ways that can occur. And this can be about raising awareness about rights, conducting research, recommending legal reforms, supporting the development and implementation of national action plans, and strengthening, of course, generic rule of law issues within the business and human rights framework. National human rights institutions can also facilitate access to remedies in indirect ways, including through developing the capacity of other various actors, providing legal assistance, intervening in remedial processes, supporting human rights defenders, and monitoring corporate grievance mechanisms. National human rights institutions can also facilitate remedies directly, of course, by accepting complaints, investigating abuses, conducting public inquiries, so on and so on. The UN report also sets out, importantly, a number of challenges that national human rights institutions face in promoting business respect for human rights and in holding businesses accountable for human rights abuses. And some, of course, innovative tools that national human rights institutions have adopted to overcome these challenges. The report concludes with a series of recommendations for both the United Nations and states, but in particular national human rights institutions and their stakeholders, including regional networks such as the organisation that I am the director for, the Asia Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institution. And those recommendations, particularly for the Asia Pacific Forum, is centred on the facilitation and exchange of innovation and good practices, including solutions developed by national human rights institutions to overcome regional specific challenges. And I hope today in our discussion with our panellists, we'll be able to hear some of the good practices and challenges that they've undertaken in regards to their work. So today is really in line with that UN report. It's about continuing a discussion on the role of national human rights institutions and facilitating access to remedies, and other human rights abuses, in particular to try to capture those experiences within the Pacific region. For the APF, I have to say this is a relatively new area for us as an organisation. We've largely engaged in the area of business and human rights through other thematic work that we've undertaken, including through our work on human rights defenders, environmental rights and climate change, and so on and so on. We hope to be able to also learn from this discussion. I'm very much looking forward to the expertise that we have available today from our panellists and our discussants, and understand how we better as a regional network can reach out to support our members. So I'll move on now to the introduction and welcome to our panellists and speakers. We have four speakers, I think four speakers. I'm not quite sure, I have to confirm whether we have the Chief Ombudsman from Tuvalu at this stage, but we have seeking to have four speakers from national human rights institutions in the Pacific, New Zealand, Samoa, Fiji, and Tuvalu. And we have a professor from the University of New South Wales who's an expert in business human rights. So those four panellists. First, the Equal Opportunities Commissioner from New Zealand Human Rights Commission, Dr. Saunoamaali'i, Karanina, Samoa. Really looking forward to her presentation. The New Zealand Human Rights Commission, of course, has been exceptionally active in the business and human rights field. We also have Director of the Human Rights of the Samoa Office of the Ombudsman and / National Human Rights Institution, Ms. Loukinikini Vili. She'll be speaking with regards to the expertise and experience of the National Human Rights Institution in Samoa. And we have the Director of Human Rights of, the Director of the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission of Fiji, Mr. Ashwin, who similarly will be speaking with regards to the Fiji Commission's experience within Fiji. And I have to confirm with our organisers, if we also have the Chief Ombudsman from the Tuvalu Ombudsman Commission with us today, Mr. Sega Talawa Taefa, we'll have Sega also speaking with us. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't, because of other commitments, have a representative from the Australian Human Rights Commission, but Professor Justine Nolan has very graciously joined us for this participation in this particular area. It's really a pleasure to have Professor Nolan here. She's the Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute for Human Rights. And Professor Nolan works quite closely with the work of the Australian Human Rights Institution, but also can speak directly to the work of the Australian Institute for Human Rights in this field. So the process that we have today is we have a series of questions. We have a number of questions which I will put out to the panellists and ask for their responses. And then we'll open it up if we have time for questions and answers from the other participants. So if we could, I could move now to the first question, and this is noting the diverse pathways that national human rights institutions can facilitate access to remedy for business-related human rights institutions. I'd like the panellists to share any key lessons they've learned or insights they've gained from your work to date. And I'd ask that each speaker limit their presentation to 5 minutes each. And if I could ask the Equal Opportunities Commissioner from New Zealand to start. Thank you.
Nisa Bulabinaka, Tena Koutou, Malol Langmama, Malol Sofomawa, distinguished speakers and friends, host Kieren Fitzpatrick, the Office of the UN Pacific, and Surya Deva, the chair of the UN Guiding Principles on the Working Group. Also want to acknowledge the Deputy Secretary of the Pacific Forum, Mr. Manoni, and all our participants and interpreters, Talofa Lava. And also just want to say Talofa again to Loukinikini, Sangal and Ashwin. I feel like we're like a team that sort of travels around. So malo lava soifua. Thank you again, Professor Deva, for inviting the Human Rights Commission to speak at this Pacific Forum. We spoke at the last one. We are very honored to be here and really appreciate our working relationship. I mean, your encouragement to us has been really significant. And as I talk about some of the examples, I hope that that you recognize the impact that you're having on our work here. The Human Rights Commission acknowledges our shared values as the Oceania family, in our pursuit, our collective pursuit of dignity and human rights for all of our people, based on our values of self-determination, equality, harmony, protection, participation, and family. A little bit of a recap. When I last spoke at the last forum, we were doing a lot of lobbying advocacy around trying to get the government to agree to develop a national action plan. Certainly in the 2014 and 2019 working group recommendations to New Zealand's UPR, it was recommended to our government that it adopt the United Nations Guiding Principles and develop an action plan. There was a particular focus on the private sector from that recommendation that should promote the role of its private sector by developing, adopting a national action plan to implement the UN Guiding Principles. There's some good news. There's been some progress, and as of last week, the Human Rights Commission was advised by the government that it's going to take the first steps of developing the National Action Plan and have invited the Human Rights Commission to be part of the leadership group to start that work. So that's a very positive sign, not only in terms of the commitment by the current government to the UN Guiding Principles, but also in terms of its recognition that the NHRI, i.e. the Human Rights Commission, has an important role in the design of those important policies. So we're very, very excited and thankful for that. So hopefully in a future forum, perhaps we can share some learning from that experience. I wanted to share just some 3 examples of some of the work that we've been doing in the human rights space. Since I took up the role, we have done a lot of public advocacy to get businesses to recognize this thing called the ethnic pay gap. There's lots of international work going on about closing the gender pay gap, but very little, if any, that's happening, certainly in Aotearoa, around a recognition of this ethnic pay gap, because we saw that the inequities were significant. And of course, one of the communities that was affected was of course Pacific. Pacific have the lowest income compared to our Asian groups and other ethnic minorities, including our Indigenous peoples. So that's a real concern. So the public awareness has increased in terms of businesses. They're talking about it. They're starting to think about how do we measure it? Because of course, that pay inequity impacts or limits the realization by Pacific peoples of their fundamental rights to shelter, to healthcare, to education, and all the other basic needs. So that has been an ongoing work in this business and human rights space. And as a result of that movement, we've had unions come out and be more public about their advocacy for it. And so we've got big businesses now, corporates now talking about how can we measure this, how can we do this? And so my next job now is to get them to hurry because Pacific people are suffering inequities, but that is great news that's happening there. In 2020, the end of 2020, I launched a national inquiry using the powers under the Human Rights Act, New Zealand's Human Rights Act, to inquire into this Pacific pay gap, as I mentioned before, because we continue to be the lowest paid, despite our obvious contribution and value to local businesses, to local economies, and the national economy of Aotearoa itself. So that inquiry is now moving ahead. And again, it's brought businesses to the table, and we're trying to make it safe so businesses don't feel like we're pointing the finger, but we're trying to identify some good practice that's happening in business that we can share around. But also, one of the targets, the 3 main target audiences for the inquiry. One is government, obviously, if there are gaps in legislation that we need to address. 2 is businesses. We want to be helpful to businesses and provide some guidelines on how they can think about equity and how they can address any unconscious bias and that sort of thing. And the 3rd audience is Pacific people ourselves. So I've heard in previous presentations in the forum today, just the lack of awareness by Pacific people in our different nations, but including Aotearoa, that they actually have rights. There is a thing called equal employment opportunities that they are entitled to. and that poverty is not inevitable. And so that realization is something that's growing. We want a social movement from our Pacific peoples here, so to help them realize their worth. And so that's an exciting piece of work. It's not easy, but we've certainly, again, we've got unions who come on board and advocate. Just last week, the public service itself has released an action plan to close not only the gender, but the ethnic pay gap. So it has been recognized at that national level in the public service that we need to act on it. So they've set a target, and that excites me as a human rights commissioner, because I live in a part of Auckland where there's huge hardship and poverty. And so to see that recognition in the public service is fantastic. And the aim now is to roll it through the rest of the public services, as well as roll it into the private sector. So tools have been developed there, and we will continue to advocate. A third example is the Human Rights Commission. Myself was invited by government to be part of a group to look at, to explore modern slavery legislation. Again, that was a recommendation that came out of the UPR, last UPR review. And so this government has acted on it and has recognized our role in that. And I suppose the key thing for me as human rights commissioner is to advocate as much as possible that any legislation is to have human rights at the center. For example, every legislation that we've looked at overseas, the businesses that are considered to be held to account, to conduct due diligence and so forth, are large businesses. It depends on the size of the business or their profit margin. My argument is that we hold people accountable based on the human rights of individual workers. So it doesn't matter if they work for a business that only has 3 or 5 people, they are human. And we need to work the legislation around the duty to protect their rights, their human rights. And therefore, they should also have access to remedy, basic fundamental rights to access to justice. So that has been my centerpiece that I reiterate over and over again. Around this table, we've got, of course, our business partners, some very large influential corporates, as well as partners from civil society. But that's a significant step for New Zealand. My role, again, is to try to encourage the working group, is not to compare ourselves with overseas and saying, let's just focus on the large corporates. We want everybody to be included. And that's a unanimous decision around this table. So public service is included, SMEs are included, as well as, of course, our large corporates, because every worker has the same equal right and must be protected. It's not about what we can do based on what's happening overseas. We want to develop a piece of legislation that reflects our context and our aspirations for our people and our public reputation and our business. So, of course, we know that modern slavery exists in New Zealand. We've heard the sister from Vanuatu talk about RSE workers. I have heard also from RSE workers. Refugees and asylum seekers are also victimized. So that is our stance on this work, is that it should be human rights centered and not based around convenience or the business size and so forth. So sensitive issues, but again, I thank the government for recognizing the role of the Human Rights Commission, the NHRI, in developing these policies, which would have huge social and economic ramifications, but we hope for the best. Now, the final challenge for us is in the COVID context, of course. We now have competing rights. There are industries where the government have to have mandated vaccines. And of course, there are people who refuse to, who are exercising their rights under the right to not accept medical treatment. But as a result, they will, of course, lose their job, which impacts their ability to provide a quality of life for themselves and others. So we now are in this context, really tricky human rights context of having competing human rights. And so that is what we've got now. And we're thinking about, how do we ensure that regardless of one's stance in terms of vaccines, and that everybody still has the right to equal opportunity to work and an adequate standard of living for themselves and others. So that's our current challenge that we're facing. And I'm doing my best to talk to businesses to see how we can help as an NHRI to promote positive messages and still have people feeling included and not not excluded from having a life of dignity. So I'll leave it at that, Kieren. Taftai lava.
Thank you so much. Gee, we're going to have to cover a lot, aren't we? Because there's quite a lot in the presentation you just made, I think, that is going to be relevant for both the region and for our other panellists. I really appreciated the 3 specific examples you provided and the context, the COVID context at the end. I imagine that the 3rd issue about the balancing of rights with regards to businesses versus questions of duty to protect, access to remedies might be considered in the National Action Plan. So we very much look forward as well to a feedback. And can I say I'm very, very pleased that the Commission is part and parcel into the development of that National Action Plan. And with regards to the ethnic pay gap, congratulations on the National Inquiry and its conduct. And I'm sure we all look forward to the report. And again, perhaps in our next webinar on this particular issue, we might have some recommendations from the National Inquiry that would be directly relevant to this as well. So thank you, Commissioner. If I may, I have some probably other questions that I think would be relevant, but I might hold them at the moment and we'll address them to the full panel because I think some of the issues you've raised are going to be relevant for them as well. So thank you so much. Can we move now to the Director of Human Rights at the Samoan National Human Rights Institution, Kini? Kini, if you could make a presentation on that question, I would really much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieren. Talafalava and warmest greetings to all our distinguished guests in this forum. A special talafalava as well to Saunoamaali'i and the rest of my NHRI colleagues. It's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this forum. So thank you to the organizers for extending this invitation for the Samoa Ombudsman Office, also NHRI, to speak and share its experience and its work on business and human rights. I think from the Samoan perspective itself, I just want to briefly highlight on some important background details of the office itself, because I feel like this explains or contributes to some of the challenges that we face as a small national human rights institution as compared to the work that Saunoamaali'i has talked about in relation specifically to the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. Now, for the Samoan National Human Rights Institution, in 2013, the Ombudsman mandate was expanded from its traditional mandate, investigating good governance, to include the protection and promotion of human rights and investigating complaints specifically on prison, against prison and police officers. So it's a little bit complicated here because we not only use the hybrid model Ombudsman/NHRI, similar to Tuvalu, as opposed to the commission model that's adopted by New Zealand, Fiji, and Australia. So like other NHRIs, we conduct human rights awareness and education, do legislative human rights compliance review, everything that Kieren has alluded to earlier. But I think at this point, I would like to note here that although we as NHRIs have similar mandates to promote and protect human rights, we, however, differ in different stages and levels and face different challenges in carrying out our mandate. So in saying that, I think there are 3 main areas that I will touch on. Given this, the capacity and resource challenges, the first one I would like to touch on is that because this area is new for our NHRI, the thing that we are doing at the moment is trying to build our capacity to understand business and human rights and how we can better address this issue. So what we have done in the past is the Australian Human Rights Commission facilitated an introductory level capacity building program that was in partnership with the New Zealand, Fiji, and Samoan Human Rights Commission. This introductory building capacity was to build the capacities of national human rights institutions in the Pacific region and their equivalent bodies. So other entities were also invited, such as CSOs and consular representatives in the Pacific, and looking at specifically on issues of migrant workers. So we found this to be very useful, because not only was the issue of business and human rights new to us, but it was also discussing the issue at the regional level, which was closer to home and more relevant to us. So we feel that this was a great example of NHRIs coming together and working together to discuss common issues and challenges and build each other's capacity and see how they can better support each other in this work. So following on from this workshop, we had actually reached out to our relevant government agencies who are dealing with the seasonal workers program to initiate discussions on how our NHRI can better facilitate or assist them in raising awareness around migrant workers' rights and available services overseas when they do enter those countries. So that was that's one of the things. Aside from this one, there are all other online courses that we are engaging in to build a capacity. The second one is the raising awareness and building capacities of government agencies and private entities. Now, with the knowledge that we have obtained thus far, we have engaged in some work in trying to how do you say, to address this issue. So one of the workshops or capacity building that we had implemented last year was sexual harassment in the workplaces. Now, this was specifically for the youth employees in the public sector. It was to raise awareness around family violence and how they can and promote healthy relationships. So it's basically to raise awareness and help them be better informed to make good choices and decisions. Now, a good outcome from this is that there was a clear recommendation that there needs to be developed an employer guide to family violence and sexual harassment to assist employers in supporting employees experiencing family violence or sexual harassment in workplaces. It also reaffirmed to the Public Service Commission, who was one of our partners, the need to follow through with their proposal to put in place a special leave for employees who may be victims of family violence. Now, one of our other workshops in capacity building that is in the pipeline is we are hoping to conduct a workshop for government agencies in mainstreaming climate change and human rights. Now, this is in specifically trying to ensure that the government entities take into account that the public are well informed and have a say in the decisions that may affect them. And I think, and the last point is, while we are also at this, we are also trying to strengthen some of our existing functions that can better address business and human rights. And this is in relation to our role or function in conducting individual complaints investigations. Because of so under our legislation, we have a discretionary power or mandate to receive complaints and may investigate. Due to the capacity and resource constraints in the past, we have just received complaints but haven't gone into investigating individual complaints. So what we've done is we note them either for possible national inquiries or refer them to relevant agencies that will be able to assist with the issues. However, through our good governance mandates, we do touch on or address human rights violations, but this is only specifically to complaints against government agencies and not in the private sector. So with our strategic plan that's in place that has become effective this year, and for the next 4 years, we are looking towards strengthening and exercising this mandate to its fullest, which means that we can receive individual complaints and investigate. The next step for us is trying to put in place proper guidelines and procedures on how to go about in investigating these complaints, individual specific human rights complaints, and also complaints that come through the good governance division. Now, which brings me to a challenge of having this dual mandate that I've already noted in the beginning, because with the good governance division, they only investigate complaints against government agencies only. And then we have our human rights mandate that will be coming out and investigating not only government, but state and private entities. So I feel like there may be a confusion with the public in saying, oh, well, you're saying you can investigate this and you can't investigate this, so which one is it? And I think it's one of the things that we will need to address in not only our awareness work around this area, but also in having clear guidelines and procedures in handling individual human rights complaints. Now, despite this, I just wanted to conclude with one last work that is very interesting at the moment, and we are looking into diving into this come next year, is the exploitation of migrant workers here in Samoa. Now, despite the confusion and the complications with our individual complaint handling system, there's this recent development in the exploitation of certain ethnic migrant workers in Samoa. And this is both in the formal and informal businesses, but mostly in the informal business. Now, it's a serious issue that the office is taking into consideration and is looking into the proper avenue to go about in addressing this. And like I've said, this is one of the areas that we will explore next year. So hopefully in the next UN Pacific Forum on Business and Human Rights, we might be able to have some update on this inquiry. But aside from, having said all that, to conclude, I think NHRIs do play a very important role in business and human rights through its broad mandate to promote and protect human rights. But however, I think it's also important to note that not all NHRIs are at the same level and same stages of implementing this work. In any case, we continue to learn specifically for the NHRIs that just recently being established and are new at the work. We continue to learn as we go, and sooner or later we will encounter these issues and have no choice but to address it. And that is why, in my view, it is important for NHRIs to continue building their capacities around these new issues, and also for NHRIs to come together and share best practices in this area. So on that note, thank you again for the opportunity and looking forward to the discussions after this.
Thank you so much, Kini. I really appreciated your presentation, love. Can I start by saying I thought it was really important that you started on the challenges and you'd indicated the question of needing to further understand the role that your institution can play and to develop its capacity in that area going forward. And I think that's really relevant, not just for our colleagues within the international community and the Office of the High Commissioner, but of course the APF as well. And I'm sure other presenters in our session today will speak on some of the resources that are being developed to assist in meeting those challenges. With regards to your stakeholder consultations, can I say I was really, really pleased to see bilateral and multilateral regional activity that's previously been undertaken. I like the synergy that your institution has taken in being able to bring previous work that is relevant to this field, and almost anything is relevant to the business and human rights field, into your discussion. So the sexual harassment, victims of family violence, the necessity for legislative change, really important issues. In terms of the going forward, the strengthening of national human rights institution functions with regards to complaint handling, but also the corresponding challenge with regards to the dual mandate of the Ombudsman and the National Human Rights Institution, I think, yes, definitely, they're going to be things moving forward that are going to have to be articulated in that awareness raising work that you'll be undertaking. And finally, the new work about migrant worker exploitation in Samoa. Yeah, we really look forward to hearing from you with regards to that kind of work in our next session. That's extraordinary. And of course, there is much experience in the broader APF membership about that very issue with sending and receiving countries and exploitation of migrant workers. Now, colleagues, we're at this point, can I say we're receiving quite a number of questions in the question and answer box on the Zoom or in the chat box. So the panelists that have already spoken, if you want to turn your attention to some of the questions and you think it's relevant for you to provide some answers, that would be really appreciated on my behalf. So now moving to the Director of the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission of Fiji, Ashwin Raj. Ashwin, over to you. Looking forward to hearing you.
Good afternoon, Kieren, and a very good afternoon to colleagues from fellow NHRIs. It's wonderful to be able to reconnect virtually. We haven't been able to see each other in almost 2 years. So I just wanted to begin by saying that one of the lessons that we've actually learned, and of course, being cognizant of the fact that this is the second, such, conversation we're having at the UN level, is that given the fact that the guiding principles are non-binding, I think the role of the national human rights institutions is absolutely fundamental, precisely because of our ability to afford remedy, to facilitate, access to justice, particularly for people who are unable to access remedy, and in the private sector, particularly given the fact that one, there is no express sort of commitment on the part of the private sector in upholding human rights, and at the same time doing everything possible to ensure that those that are employed in the private sector don't necessarily know what those fundamental rights are. The work that the National Human Rights Institution's done in relation to migrant workers has been very, very critical. As you know, since 2016, we've been dealing with a number of, foreign nationals, particularly, Filipino workers in the construction sector, particularly in relation to bonded labor and confiscation of passports. More recently, we've been working with Bangladeshi workers, again, issues in relation to contracts, fully understanding what they are signing in terms of contracts, issues of confiscation of passport, inhumane conditions in which they have to labor, of course, suspension of the economy of rights that should invariably be afforded to people under the labor laws of the country, we've also looked at, foreign workers from India in one of the other, sectors. And again, lots of issues in relation to, recruitment in terms of, what was promised in contracts and what, eventually was given to them. This all gets very, very complicated, of course, in the context of the pandemic, where there's a suspension of a whole, set of rights for these foreign workers because, they are not, citizens of the country. And they are outside the fold and the comfort of the nation state of theirs. And so, the National Human Rights Institution is the only avenue for them to be able to access remedy. And it becomes very, very critical. Lots of challenges in relation to, them being intimate with our laws, being intimate with our labor laws, constitutional rights and freedoms, in relation to how to access a national human rights institution, obviously in a context where, people generally dissuade them from accessing National Human Rights Institution, not being able to understand the relationship between the National Human Rights Institution and other state agencies such as the Department of Immigration, the Ministry of Labor, the Fiji Police Force, and all of that. And these are very, very practical challenges that effectively dissuade people from accessing remedy, having access to justice, and so on and so forth. This all gets very, very complicated because they're already, marginalized, particularly in the context of the pandemic, when they are, to be repatriated back to their home countries, and suddenly, they have to end up, paying whatever, money they would have saved for COVID tests and all of that. And so, there's exploitation at various levels, and the Commission's been very actively working in those areas. We have, of course, worked on other very, very critical issues, and that has to do with the fact that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on our ability to realize social and economic rights. I mean, unprecedented level of job losses, exacerbated levels of poverty, unprecedented levels of violence, in the homes and all of that. And so the Commission has been on its feet, dealing with, provision of food packages, rations, vouchers, all of that. And this is where we actually saw that the business community can actually become very, very important allies, particularly when the state is stretched as far as the resources are concerned. And the Commission has been able to very, very successfully work with a few business communities to be able to raise the necessary funds and provide food vouchers to people who do not have, food, who needed, urgent shelter. We've looked at a number of, instances where we've had to appeal to, business communities to provide for, hotel accommodation and all of that, in instances where there's been arbitrary eviction and all of that. So we've also had, instances where the business communities come out to be, allies of human rights. And so we thought, the real challenge is how do you actually keep them on the path of human rights and sustain this conversation rather than thinking of it as, a philanthropic sort of exercise here or there. How do you sustain this culture and make them allies of human rights? And this has become particularly important in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also given the existential threat of climate change. And so I think we got to have a lot more conversation about how do we make sure that we get businesses into this conversation about climate change and COVID-19, because they're inextricably woven into the fabric of emergent human rights challenges that we are suddenly, confounded with. Of course, the Commission has dealt with issues of sexual harassment. And one of the cases, made it in the news, and it just underscores how much work there needs to be done in this area as far as sexual harassment is concerned and gender-based violence. So the Commission has had its hands full, but at the same time, we've also had very, very interesting, calls and conversations from the business community to the National Human Rights Institution too, because of the policy of mandatory vaccination. And the obligations that the business communities have under the law as far as occupational health and safety is concerned, and as far as their commitment under the Employment Relations Act is concerned. So suddenly the business community too, like the rest of us, has had to deal with the issue of competing set of rights, and they have appealed to the National Human Rights Institution. The National Human Rights Institution has also worked with trade unions in mediating and facilitating where contracts have been cut short, in instances where businesses have invoked a force majeure, which is act of God, and suddenly cut salaries and all of that. So we've had a very, very interesting conversation with business communities in relation to business and human rights, which has also been constructive. Not all the conversations we've had and interventions we made have been retrogressive. So I think that the pandemic has also created the conditions, possibility for very constructive engagement with the private sector in making them allies of human rights. Of course, we've been working with the Human Resource Institute. Last year, we dealt with the issue of unconscious bias, and this year they've invited us to speak on business and human rights itself. And we see that institute as an integral, player in all of this. One of the issues, and before I close, Kieren, one of the issues that I did want to raise is the fact that, one of the major challenges we find in all of this is, given the transboundary nature of some of the challenges around business and human rights, we need to coordinate better as national human rights institutions. I've dealt with foreign migrant workers where I've tried to deal with countries that they come from and the respective national human rights institutions from there, but it hasn't been successful. So we need to think about how do we coordinate better. We need to think about the relationship between the national human rights institutions in these respective countries and parallel state agencies. I mean, I'm equally guilty. The Human Rights Commission in Fiji needs to do a lot more work with the Department of Immigration, with the Fiji police force and all of that. And there's got to be greater coordination. If there is no proper mechanism, there's no national strategy, then the principles are just principles. We need to have a national plan of action. We need to be able to coordinate better. We need to be able to afford remedy in such a way that, as we as national human rights institutions raise some of these issues about interdiction of fundamental rights and freedoms, other state agencies are not absolutely gobsmacked and wondering what we're talking about. The other thing is we need to fight a lot more in relation to prejudice as it affects people vis-a-vis the nation state. A lot of times the National Human Rights Commission also receives a lot of flack for speaking on behalf of migrant workers, foreign nationals and all of that, saying that we should be more focused on citizens of this country. Very problematic view that again needs to be deconstructed. And so we have to remind everybody that Fiji has ratified the convention, the ILO convention on violence and harassment in the workplace, that we have ratified, the international convention that protects, migrant workers and their families. And so there's inherent obligation to all of this, and business communities have a role to play, and so does the state. But the state, of course, is a partial and incipient fragment in this entire kaleidoscope. So the real conversation is, how do we ensure, in the strictest sense, that we are able to horizontally and vertically apply the Bill of Rights? That's where we are in Fiji. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashwin. Again, a lot to be covered, and I'm sure it's going to generate a lot of questions. And indeed, we're already still receiving questions. So panelists, if you have the opportunity, I've seen that many of you have already started to respond, but that'd be great if you could keep that up. Ashwin, I was really interested, again, in your focus that the National Human Rights Institution, given the marginalised nature of the abuses and the communities, is likely to be the access point for remedies rather than other institutions of state. And I think that only reinforces the important role that national human rights institutions can play or should play in this particular environment. I particularly, again, liked your point about the impact of COVID on economic and social rights, civil and political, of course, as well, but your relationship then with the business community stakeholders and the provision of support. You mentioned, questions of hotel accommodation, food vouchers, et cetera, given the limitations that the state was under, how this could be sustained going forward, I think is an exceptionally important point. And you link that to climate change related issues as well. And I think, yes, it is, clearly. One thing that I think would be really worthy of conversation going forward is the question of trans-border engagement and trans-border violations, and the role of national human rights institutions. And you were quite clear, it wasn't just institutions, it was other agencies of state. Because the institutions are not the eye of the needle on which all human rights complaints need to be fed through, but other agencies of state have to play, given that business crosses borders and that there are violations throughout the region which bring into question extraterritoriality related concerns. And indeed, we see that particularly at the moment with climate change related violations in the business and human rights field. finally, I thought, again, worthy of more consideration is this tension that you talked about between equality and non-discrimination, and you're a commission for Fijians and protecting the human rights of Fijians, and you know the narrative around that and the tensions around that and the awareness raising that you play. So thank you very much, Ashwin, on that. Colleagues, unfortunately, our colleague, the Ombudsman from Tuvalu, is not with us today. So we will now move to Professor Justine Nolan from the Australian Human Rights Institute at the University of New South Wales. Justine, again, I think focusing on the kind of questions that we had raised earlier, but can I say, but given that you're not from a national institution, also the types of issues that have been raised about the challenges, the necessity for additional training, capacity, resource development, I think those would be really useful things if you could address it in your presentation as well. Over to you, Justine.
Thank you so much, Kieren. And, let me just first acknowledge the expertise of the speakers who've come before me. I think if we were having this conversation 5 years ago or more than 10 years ago, national human rights institutions would probably have not been in the conversation. But the ability of particularly these three institutions to have built their capacity and their expertise in this area is amazing and very much needed. And so, very much acknowledge their expertise in this field. And I, as Kieren said, I'm not with a national human rights institution. And I think I was here to talk more about how they may work with others and may work with external stakeholders beyond that. So I'm based at the Australian Human Rights Institute, which is a research and advocacy institute based at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. But we've had a close relationship with the Australian Human Rights Commission, particularly on some business and human rights issues. And, for me, it's really important that national human rights institutes, because they have limited capacity, both internally with expertise, but also resources, regularly try and partner with others in this field to sort of, have more outreach, be able to increase their capacity to not only increase their own knowledge, but also to develop training for others. And that's how we've worked with the Commission. They've got some very knowledgeable and resourceful members on staff who are also experts in business and human rights in their own respect, but they also regularly partner with others. So for most recently, the Australian Human Rights Commission developed a joint report with us, which basically did a stocktake of the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in Australia in the last 10 years. And we were then able to sort of do that research together and jointly publish that. And it increased both their ability and our ability to reach out to a much broader group of stakeholders. I mean, for me, being outside a commission, it's easy for me to sort of look at, here's what you should do and how they might work. It's obviously much harder when you're inside to get these things done. But one of the really important things for me in this field is that national human rights institutes continue to operate independently because there's very much this tension, particularly with the power and leverage of business to shape policy, to shape government policy, and to shape government advocacy. And national human rights institutes have a very powerful independent voice to work with business, to work with government, to work with civil society, but also when necessary, to speak up against all of those to defend human rights. And I think that maintaining that level of independence for national human rights institutes in this field, almost more than any other, is really important in the work that they have done. And that's why I think it was really interesting to hear the comments, particularly from Ashwin, about the need for institutions to provide a path to remedy. Because what we've seen in the last 10 years and what our report with the Australian Human Rights Commission highlighted in this area was that remedy in particular is lacking. And the UN Business and Human Rights Working Group has noted this in their report as well, saying that this is sort of the forgotten third pillar in many ways. And this is where institutions can be really effective. And it will depend on their mandate. So for some, they will have a mandate to be able to provide a remedy, to investigate. Others they won't, but what they might do is be working with civil society or other mechanisms with government to push for a remedy to be provided and to use their expertise to advocate for that. And so it may not always be that the path is within the institution itself, but the institution, regardless, should be a powerful advocate for trying to find an effective remedy for business and human rights issues within their jurisdiction. And it's also very true that many of the most significant issues on business and human rights, and almost every issue that each of the commissioners has mentioned, is a trans-border issue, because business just doesn't, business operates beyond borders. Business has no borders. And so unless, particularly within our region, if we work together, then otherwise we're going to have a very piecemeal approach, to looking at this. I think what we've seen is that with the three representatives we have here today have really built their capacity over the last 10 years and expertise in this field, but also recognize that many institutions have a very different level of capacity. And I know that UNDP, particularly out of their Bangkok office, is really looking to build the capacity of national human rights institutes in business and human rights and try and increase their capacity, build their resources and offer trainings. Because the first step for national human rights institutes is to build their internal capacity so that they have greater expertise on this, obviously, before they can then offer trainings, advice, advocacy, remedy to those outside their own organisations. But I think what we've also seen in these three presentations is really different ways of working, and all of them, effective, fantastic in different ways. And so in this field in particular, there is not one path to sort of improving and respecting the rights of those of survivors in this area that have been abused by business. There really are many different paths, and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the working group really acknowledge this, particularly in relation to remedy, that there are lots of things that need to happen. And institutions themselves will also in many ways have to work with business, but sometimes call business to account. And that, for me, is also the same with government. They need to work with government and also call them to account when things need to change or there needs to be improvements. And that's where working with university academics, working with civil society is really helpful, because it will often give national human rights institutes another, almost another staff in many ways to help them develop a report, develop a training program, or, build their own expertise internally and seek advice in relation to that. So, I think in many ways, I think it's really significant that we're having this discussion in this second year of the forum that includes national human rights institutes, and also that, the three on this call really recognise their significant ability, which they can have an impact in this area. And all of the areas that have been mentioned are really replicated in all our countries, whether it's around migrant workers, whether it's around forced labour, whether it's around issues of discrimination. We're seeing all of these issues are coming up in each of our countries. And so that's where we can learn from each other very much, in this field. So I think, in my respect, standing outside and looking in to national human rights institutions, I think the important thing for me is considering and maintaining their independence so that they can work with expertise and expert stakeholders, but also hold them to account. Focus on this issue of building internal capacity and reaching out to experts when that's needed. And then also, when they're ready, provide training and expertise to others within, their society, civil society in particular, but also business, because part of it is increasing the education of business around these issues, and government. Some governments are more amenable to these issues and some aren't. And so there is this education process. And thirdly, looking at the issue of remedy and thinking about where the institution itself has leverage to improve, or where it needs to work with others outside the institution in order to improve the prospects of remedy for victims within their jurisdiction. So I will leave it at that, Kieren, so we can have some more discussion.
Many thanks, Justine. Really appreciated your presentation. To start with, can I say I think you're right in your opening address that 10 years ago this debate wouldn't be happening with national human rights institutions, and we've seen a growth in understanding, awareness, role, capability, even though there is, I think, still considerable ways to go with regards to that. And I think you're also right in asserting that given capacity constraints of national human rights institutions, there's a corresponding willingness and I think a requirement really to partner with other experts within the field who can provide additional support for the capacity of an institution. I appreciated then the example you provided with regards to your partnership with the Australian Human Rights Institution. I particularly like maybe there's an opportunity later on, Justine, around the work that UNDP may play in providing resources, and we'll get to that in a minute, I think. But I appreciated, as you said, that the third pillar, the remedy pillar, is still lacking, reinforcing the transborder issues, but stressing that there is no really one path, that each of these paths is entirely contextual. And again, this is one of the advantages I think national human rights institutions can play. They're vested within the context of their nation state. They understand those dynamics. As you stress, they're the ones that should be facilitating access to remedies, even if the remedy is not relying with them in particular. So with that, colleagues, again, I see that we've got a variety of different chats coming in and questions coming again. So if you've got the opportunity when you're not speaking, it'd be great if you could provide some responses with that. I'm now going to open up just one further question. I think we'll just give them time. I think we'll move off from the remainder of the questions, but just one before we open it up further. Colleagues, and you don't all have to answer, is what are some of the ways that you think that national human rights institutions can collaborate with each other to address business and human rights related issues? What are you seeking from that collaboration? Would someone like to respond to that?
If Ashwin and Loukinikini don't mind, if I just drop in some hints. I mean, certainly for the Human Rights Commission in New Zealand, this is new territory for us, and it's fast-moving territory. So the learnings that that we gain, we're happy to share with our friends in the region. And considering labor mobility, our people are moving across the region in and out of each other's countries. And obviously, businesses in Fiji are doing business with New Zealand, and New Zealand's doing business with Samoa. So we have a lot in common. So the players that we are trying to bring to the party to adhere to these principles, a lot of them are the same. So, I think we have an opportunity to sort of think about some commonalities. And certainly if we're thinking about trade relationships, I was really interested in the European Union's presentation where the trade agreements have specific clauses. I mean, if we can have the same clauses, around fundamental human rights protections, between our three countries that have NHRIs, I mean, that could be a possibility. So we echo each other's, well, not each, it would be, so the countries echo the duty to uphold and protect human rights, and the companies who are operating in the region, here that we're speaking the same language, that might be something we could collaborate on. Okay.
Kieren, if I may.
Yes, go on, Ashwin.
Okay, so I was just thinking, and spot on, Karanina. I mean, one of the good examples that I think we can possibly start with is seasonal workers, people who go to pick fruits or work in butcher and all of that. I think we can do a little sort of kind of a model just to see whether the coordinating mechanism actually works. If we were to just look at seasonal workers, and we do get accounts of them being treated badly and all of that. Can we use a little model like that just to see whether transboundary regional mechanism of NHRIs is actually possible, and whether we can use that to then coordinate with various embassies and missions and all of that to be able to bring back those plights to the attention of people, whether it be private contractors, whether it be about the role of the state and all of that. Because I always keep thinking, okay, we talk about these principles and salutary as they are, how do we make sure that it actually, works for us, when rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
And that to me is the real issue, because, to be very honest, for us at the National Human Rights Institution, we run an ER. I mean, we do 24/7. And, recently we've been in the business of buying food, buying underwear, buying, clothes, paying for doctors and all of that from our pockets to make sure that these people get, some form of relief, temporary relief that, companies should be providing, that, immigration authorities should be holding those companies to account and all of that. And I just think, given the fact that we are not adequately resourced and will never be, I mean, the point is that, these kind of costs just keep coming, and we never anticipated those things. Can we have some kind of coordinating mechanism between NHRIs across the region so that we're able to effectively deal with it? And if we had like a model, to experiment with in the first place, with seasonal workers in the region, I think that might be a good start. And then we can sort of move that model around, because the real issue is, as Justine was very astutely reminding all of us, these are transboundary. I mean, business is not, locked within a certain nation state. It's very, very, protean in nature, and rights too. Rights are not necessarily, given its universal, purchase. They're not stuck in nation states. I mean, we're made to think that rights are locked within nation states and all of that. But our business is to make sure that, it moves beyond frontiers and all of that. And I think national human rights institutions have a huge role to play in all of this. So can we have that kind of conversation so that when our workers go to Australia or New Zealand, first of all, they know that they have certain rights, that none of these rights are being hijacked because they're leaving the shores of Fiji or they're leaving Samoa, for instance, that these rights are actually universal. They are transboundary. It's not just labor which is moving. It's not just capital which is moving. Rights is on the move too. And I think that's something that we need to push more aggressively.
Thank you, Ashwin. I'm just conscious of our time. In response, can I just say I think that's an excellent idea, and there are previous examples beyond the Pacific region where such an arrangement exists. So with regards to transborder issues, particularly in the area of impacts of climate change and business for human rights, we've had examples from both the Philippines, Malaysia and Indonesia of each of those three institutions accepting complaints of violations outside of their territory, but with regards to a business corporation that had been registered within their territory, creating human rights violations in an external territory. And there's, of course, questions of jurisdictions that flow from that, but these have been grappled by those institutions. So I think there might be some good examples about how that could be potentially considered within the Pacific region, and the APF will take it upon itself following this to gather those examples and to distribute them to the national human rights institutions within the Pacific. The second issue is, in particular, the questions of seasonal workers or exploitation of migrant worker-related issues. And again, quite a lot of experience in the broader Asia Pacific with memorandums of understanding between national human rights institutions of sending and receiving countries, where those memorandums of understanding commit both of those institutions for information flow and the follow-up of human rights violations with regards to nationals within another national human rights institution's territory. So I think in both of those instances, there are certainly previous examples that we can build upon to discuss the question of seasonal workers. So colleagues, we now have 4 minutes to go. Thank you to all of those who have answered the questions and answers that have been placed on the chat box and in the question and answer session. Can I ask all of the panelists to, before you sign off, if you've got some relevant information, even if it's just linking some reports, that would be really, really useful. And could I thank all of our 4 panelists for their presentations. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really do appreciate the limited capacity of national human rights institutions. And so you have invested quite a considerable time from here. From the APF side, there are some lessons learned that we need to do, which is further capacity development national human rights institutions in that field. And with that, unless there are any further comments from the panelists, I'll hand back to Robert.
Kieren, I just wanted to say that Ombudsman Sa'anga has joined the conversation.
Hi, Ombudsman. Lovely to see you.
Thank you, Kieren, and thanks all for the participants from joining from the NHRIs. It's great to see everybody after so long, and been away from Fiji for myself as well. And just also great to hear all the different topics being discussed. I think really important, some of the issues raised, particularly, I mean, most of you will know me from my different hat with the climate change, but I remember thinking a couple of years ago when I got back to work on this issue that, you know, how can you talk about climate change when you don't address business and human rights, given that 10 companies in the world produce 70% of the carbon emissions? So I think there are all these kind of important different aspects where we tend to be working on business and human rights, even if we don't actually call it that issue, which I think has come out during the discussions we have right now. And I think that's a good segue for us to move into our next session, which look at climate change, the environment, reaching net zero and realizing the right to a healthy environment. So we'll reconvene at 3:15 Fiji time. And thanks again to all the participants. Thank you.